Fire. Thank you.
Perfect.
Sorry.
No worries. Awesome. Yeah. So, like I said, my name is Brian Timmer. Um, and yeah, so I'm going to talk to you today about a few different things, but all related to kelp forests, essentially in a warming ocean, looking into the past and then also thinking about what's going on right now and what's going to be happening in the future with kelp forests here in British Columbia. So kelp forests cover a large portion of our world's coastlines. In total, it's about a third of our coastlines, actually. And mostly that's in the temperate regions, so sort of to the north and south hemispheres, outside of the tropics, largely. And we altogether have about 5 times as big of an area of kelp forests along the globe as we do coral reefs. So this is a massive. They're maybe not the poster child of our oceans, but they take up a lot of space and they're very, very important in a lot of our nearshore ecosystems. And here on the west coast of North America, when we think of kelp forests, often we just sort of think of the two main large surface canopy forming species, which is giant kelp, Macrocystis pyrifera, and bull kelp, Nereocystis loeckiana. And so these are the two big kelps that on the left and right side of this poster here basically start at the bottom and grow really quickly and very large and come all the way up to the surface, where they form these really dense and productive canopies. And so colloquially, we say kelp forest, and this is usually what we think of because it's something that we see when we're out on, say, a kayak or walking along the breakwater. It's what most people are familiar with, but it's also important to recognize that we do have a really great diversity of kelp species here on the BC coast. And so there's a lot of what we call understory kelps, which are maybe not quite as tall, maybe not coming all the way to the surface, but also play a really important role in our nearshore ecosystems. And kelp forests around the world are at a fair amount of risk to climate change. There was a recent special report that came out from the IPCC that stated that next to coral reefs, which we've all seen have been doing horrendously over the past couple of years, next to coral reefs, kelp forests are the most at-risk marine ecosystem, with seagrass meadows trailing closely behind due to climate change. And it's important that we know about this and are thinking about this because our kelp forests, like I mentioned before, are very important to the rest of the ecosystem that's in our waters. Because they're so productive and they create habitat and all these different things. There's this great paper that came out a few years ago from Anne Schaffer and her team where they looked at preferential habitat use by kelp forests or in kelp forests. So things like herring and salmon and surf smelt, these larger fishes as well as tiny little forage fishes that are actively choosing to go and use kelp forests as habitat when they have the choice. And it's not only these areas with where the kelp is directly that are important. The kelp, since it grows so fast and it sloughs off so much material into the surrounding waters, there's a lot of connectivity between kelp forests and eelgrass beds and other nearshore ecosystems. And there's some other really great papers out there showing that just the amount of detritus that's coming off of these kelp forests and moving into other areas of the ocean is also really important for boosting productivity of other species that we care about, things like rockfish, for example. And I could talk for quite some time about how important kelp forests are, but I find the best way to really drive this point home and show you how cool they are is just to actually show you some kelp forests. So this is a video from a couple of years back now. I was doing some field work up in the Broughton Archipelago, and this is a bull kelp forest, so Nereocystis. And as we look underneath the water, you see just how absolutely massive these canopies can be. Huge blades. You can see my left hand on the kelp there just to kind of give some scale of how large this is. And these really are just like these big underwater trees that are just creating this amazing, immense habitat that can be used by all sorts of creatures and species. And so my own kind of like kelp forest journey really is quite place-based in and around the Salish Sea. So on my dad's side of the family, where I was born on the Lower Mainland, my dad is Stalo, which is a group of First Nations from the around the Fraser River area. And so I have ancestors, going back for a long, long time who lived in and worked around the Salish Sea before it was called the Salish Sea. And when I was quite young, we actually moved out to the Okanagan, and so the interior of BC. And I was raised there and went through high school and all that. And after high school, I had become a scuba diving instructor. The ocean was always sort of calling me, and I figured that would be a good way to get around and see different places and get to work in the ocean. And so I spent some time down south in the tropics before eventually coming back and settling down on the east coast of Vancouver Island in Nanaimo. And so when I was in Nanaimo, I was actually working as a scuba instructor at a place called Sundown Diving. It's fantastic if you ever look to go diving in Nanaimo. And we would go out to these sites all the time in the Nanoose area. And there's this great sort of like rocky shoreline up there. So we could go and do these shore dives all the time. And every single shore dive, you'd swim out into the water, go out over the rocks, and off to the side, there were these just beautiful kelp, bull kelp forests that we would, you'd see it on your way out, you go down deeper, you'd swim around, look at stuff, you come back up, and then you would do what's called a safety stop. So you basically have to off gas the nitrogen that you've built up in your system while you're in the shallows before leaving the water. And so my favorite thing to do was swim around and go find a nice spot in this gorgeous kelp forest. And I would actually lean back on my tank and I would look up into the kelp forest and just watch the light coming through. I'd watch the fish swimming around. It was just incredible. It was like, being in a giant aquarium or something like that. And I would bring I would take people out on guided dives and I'd bring them and show them. And it was just one of my favorite things. And around this time, I also started an undergraduate degree at the Vancouver Island University in biology. And that next year is when the big blob marine heat wave hit. So around, I think it technically started in 2013, but around 2014, it mostly hit kind of our coast on the West Coast. And basically, this was this huge marine heat wave that raised surface temperatures in the ocean quite a bit more than they normally would have been. And so you can see this plot on the left showing kind of this temperature anomaly offshore. But if you look in between Vancouver Island and the mainland, you can also see that the temperatures were getting really, really hot in the Salish Sea, kind of up in the Strait of Georgia area where I was going diving all the time. And within the course of about a year, we basically had these kelp forests just completely disappear from the coastline. So all of my favorite dive sites just completely lost all of the kelp, and it's been about a decade now, and they haven't come back. It was just like a complete wipeout. And what that looks like when you have these kelp that are just sort of boiling alive in the water is the tissues get really white and thin, and they kind of start disintegrating, and the kelp itself actually stops growing, so it might not even reach all the way to the surface. And it sort of just falls apart and dies. And so after kind of witnessing this and seeing all of this happen quite early in my undergraduate career, that kind of really kicked off this thing inside of me to A, want to figure out what's going on with all this kelp, and B, what can we actually do about this, if anything. And so I finished up my undergraduate degree. I went on and got a master's, did some remote sensing stuff, looking at kelp forests using like drones and satellites and all that. And all this time thinking a lot about what's going on, knowing what I could see around me with kelp forests, but thinking about what's going on the larger BC coast. And so I was lucky enough when I got involved with my PhD here in the BOM lab at the University of Victoria, to get to work with some really great collaborators. And over the past couple of years, we put together this paper where we were thinking about, okay, so what's actually happening? You know, we kind of know in our own local area here what's going on, but what's are the broader trends along the BC coast from this big recent events. And so this paper is, I think it's actually technically accepted now. It's just going through some real final editing stages. But basically, the idea was we were going to pull together all of these different types of data, different environmental data, and all these different sort of accounts of kelp and where it might be, and really build a more holistic picture of what was happening on our coast and sort of try to put together the most complete overview of the status of kelp for BC. And so I'll walk through this figure really quickly, actually, on the left here. So all of these numbers represent a lighthouse. And so there's this great lighthouse data on our coast here, where you have these great timelines going back in time to actually look at what sea surface temperatures were in the past. And so this plot is just showing for these different lighthouses what the temperature was over this sort of marine heat wave period. And you can see that some of these temperatures, like sites 3, 4, and 5, which are 3, 4, and 5, get quite a lot warmer up above the yellow line, which is 18 degrees, and then the red line, which is 20. And it's around these temperatures that kelp really just starts dying off completely. And so we took that data and we also went out and took a whole bunch of like airplane data and things from drones and scuba surveys and boats, and satellites, and kind of mashed that all together as best we could to really sort of figure out what was happening with these kelp forests. And since you know, you're using all these different types of data, it's kind of hard to be very exact with saying, you know, kelp has gone up a little bit, it's gone down a little bit, because kelp forests can be really dynamic ecosystems. They can change their amount on the shoreline based on totally natural events. And so what we did is we classified loss, stable, and gain only if the loss would be, for example, if the kelp was completely lost from the shoreline. And then if it was stable, even if the kelp went down, we couldn't really say how much it went down. So we just said, okay, well, that's stable. It's at least still there. It might bounce back. And then it was only a gain if it was completely gone before, and then it came back into the area. And so for an example, for some of the helicopter imagery that we looked at, for example, this is kind of what that would look like, where you have these photos on the top that have this kelp forest going along the shoreline, and then in the more modern photos on the bottom where that kelp has disappeared. And as you can imagine, you know, along this really heterogeneous coastline with all sorts of different environmental factors, we have a lot of mixed results, and that is, you know, something to be expected. And so I'll kind of walk you through, we'll break down some of these areas by region to look at some of the overarching trends that we really were able to pull out from these data. So starting in the Salish Sea, we had some case studies where we were able to show that during and after the blob, there's these pretty big losses of kelp. But really within this region, there were very highly variable trends, as you can see from these bar graphs. Remember, the red is the loss, and then the blue is the stability, the light blue. And maybe not too surprisingly, but these losses of kelp, when we zoom in into these areas, were really highly correlated with high temperatures. And so if you look at these maps, you can see that in areas like the Strait of Georgia, where the water temperature gets quite warm in the summer, you can see that that's where a lot of these losses, these red dots, are occurring. And sometimes it's even on one side of the island, whereas the other side of the island stays a little bit cooler, and so the kelp there seems more stable. And you can also see all along the Juan de Fuca, basically until you get into Barkley Sound, there's lots of stability going along here, and then you turn into Barkley Sound and you start having some losses again. And we were also able to kind of look at the timing of some of these losses. So this is just sort of like before and after with whatever data we could use from before and after the actual uh, heat wave. But we also had some time series. So we were actually able to piece together using scuba diver data from both the dive shop that I used to work at, as well as our friends up at Hornby Island Divers, and piece together timelines actually showing of when we had kelp and then when it disappeared. And so we were able to show not only had the kelp been lost, but in a lot of cases, it was directly related to that large blob heat wave. And I mentioned as well in Barkley Sound. So for those of you who have been lucky enough to make your way out to Bamfield before, you know, this is an absolutely gorgeous area. And another paper that I was lucky enough to work on with Sam Starko, who is the lead of this paper, recently showed that there's this big gradient as you go in towards the back of Barkley Sound, where the temperature sort of just keeps getting warmer and warmer. And that was also really highly correlated with losses of kelp, and that those losses also largely occurred during that big marine heat wave. So on both sides of the island, we've got this evidence showing that the blob was really doing horrible things to the kelp during that time just because it was getting so warm. But there was another thing that was happening around this time, kind of right around the start of the marine heat wave, which was sea star wasting disease. And basically what happened was between about Mexico and Alaska, there's this massive wasting disease where sea stars of all species started kind of just wasting away, and their limbs would fall off and they would get all curled up and gross. You can see a photo on the right side of the screen of kind of a healthy sea star kind of starting to waste away, and then the sort of aftermath of the goop that's left behind. And this was super relevant to us as kelp forest ecologists, of course, because some sea stars, especially sunflower sea stars, are a predator of sea urchins. And so then there was papers as well that were coming out from back then showing that as sea stars began wasting away and disappearing from the ecosystems, urchins started moving up in abundance in those same ecosystems. And so up in northern BC, where we didn't see as high of temperatures, but we saw some pretty big losses, the question is, okay, well, what's happening here if it isn't the temperature? And when we zoom into that region and start looking at some of the data, we can see that there are kind of most of these losses happening on the backsides of some of these islands and in some of the more sheltered channels. And on the right side of the screen, you can see some photos of basically these sea urchins that were creating these large urchin barrens coming right up into the intertidal. And I'll give you a couple examples of just the scale of some of these. So this is all from helicopter imagery. And as it's flying by, it's just taking photos of the shoreline. And you can see that basically right up and into the intertidal. And I actually, in person, I've never actually seen sea urchins above the intertidal line. Usually they're fast enough to kind of get down because they don't really like it getting dried out. But there's so many sea urchins here that they just have completely wiped out everything below the waterline. And you can imagine that that's going to have, you know, quite a significant effect on a lot of the local species that are relying on these kelp forests. And so based on some of this data that we're looking at, we've got kind of two key drivers emerging in kelp loss. One of those is those trophic interactions happening in northern BC in some of those inlets and channels. And then we've also got temperature-driven losses, especially down in the Salish Sea. And it's important to note that sometimes or often these things can be overlapping and interacting. This isn't just a really simple case of this is happening here and this is happening here. Often a lot of this stuff is happening at the same time. These are just some really good examples to kind of illustrate what's going on. And so Here's an example from Barkley Sound, some ROV surveys that we were doing. So basically like a little VCR with a camera on the front that cruises through the water. It's tethered to the surface, and so you're piloting from a boat. But as you're cruising along, you can take video of what's happening underwater, which is fantastic for these nearshore surveys. And this is one of the urchin barrens. And you can see as you're cruising along, we're only in a couple meters of water here. So this should be prime kelp forest habitat, but there's urchins everywhere. And then once you get up into the shallows, you can see that there's this really thin fringe of kelp that's still kind of hanging on and doing its thing and sort of swashing back and forth in the waves. And so what we figure is on the outer coast I'll go back a couple here. On the outer coast from these maps, there's probably also urchins on those outer coasts, but they're being basically forced down a little bit further into the subtidal by the wave action of being sort of more exposed. And then that's why it's only the insides of the islands that the urchins are able to kind of come right up into the shallows. And so there are multiple stressors going on here. And then there's kind of this interesting phenomenon where the sort of more central areas in BC that we were looking at were quite stable. And so trying to think of why that might be happening. And we started looking into basically just different possibilities. And the most obvious thing was just that we know about this sunflower star and urchin relationship, but sunflower stars aren't the only ones that are actually eating our urchins. We also obviously have sea otters. And so sea otters are, when they're in the same areas as these sunflower stars, we get this thing called functional redundancy. And so basically, they're both eating the urchins. And that way, if you lose one of them, technically the other one might still kind of be hanging around and eat enough urchins to keep those populations down. And so when we did lose all of our sea stars, or most of our sea stars along the coast, there were some areas where we actually still had sea otters hanging around to still keep those urchin populations down lower. And on most of British Columbia, sea otters were actually hunted to extirpation quite a while ago, but they were reintroduced basically in Checklisset Bay up on the sort of northwest coast of Vancouver Island back in the early 1970s. And since then, they've been sort of expanding in their range, and it sort of matches up quite nicely with these areas of kelp resiliency, where we see a lot of stability in these populations. And so this is a graph actually from a DFO report, but shows on the left side here, we've got this timeline with the number of otters along the coast, and it's just going up and up and up and up until you're coming into more modern times, and it still seems to be growing. And again, this one spot here at Checklisset Bay, this is where the first otters were released, and now they can be found all the way down past Clayoquot Sound, and every once in a while you'll actually see a sea otter down in Barkley Sound, and even there's one that I know of that kind of pops up off of Race Rocks once in a while down by Victoria. And then also all the way up along parts of the central coast of BC, mostly on kind of the more exposed parts. But yeah, they're definitely making their way up. And so this seems like a pretty kind of cut and dry solution of, okay, well, if the sea otters are coming back, that's how we can help with kelp. That's great. But it's not quite as simple as that, because there are also a fair amount of concerns. I know that there are numerous First Nations, for example, that are worried a little bit about basically the sea otters coming in and just eating absolutely everything, because sea otters can be super, super voracious. They keep the urchin populations in check, but they also keep populations of a lot of other things down as well. And if they're just left completely up to their own, like if you ever go out and see them in, say, Clayoquot Sound or something, you can see massive rafts of them all over the place, and they definitely eat a lot. And so, yeah, there's some concerns about purposefully moving sea otters into newer areas to reestablish them if the First Nations aren't allowed to, say, hunt or keep them out of certain areas that are used for harvesting, because that can just totally decimate the food security in some areas. And so we know that there are these problems going on in BC with kelp forests, but then the question becomes, what can we do about it? And so, as ecologists, and especially in modern ecology, climate change is everywhere. It's affecting all sorts of things. And so we're kind of moving past that point, I think, of, just watching it and documenting it as it happens and starting to think, okay, like, worst case scenario, what can we actually do about this? And so that was really where the Kelp Rescue Initiative kind of came from. It's this group of scientists, and really our collective goal is sort of building knowledge to accelerate restoration of coastal ecosystems. And so mostly focusing on kelp forests, but all the things that they support as well. And that includes all sorts of things from looking at genomics to looking at climate and kelp modeling around different parts of the coast. We do a lot of field surveys and experiments, and then, of course, kelp restoration research. And ultimately, the idea here is that we're not doing this just so that we have all the tools to restore kelp, but our goal is really to support Indigenous stewardship on the coast of BC. There are numerous First Nations that are seeing these kelp losses occur in their territories and wanting to actually do something about it. I hear stories of especially the Guardian Watchman programs that go out and they're using drones and things to monitor these kelp forests, and they really don't want to sit back idly by and just watch them all disappear. They want to do something about it. And so our goal is to kind of bring down these barriers to make sure that, we've gone through and done as much as we can to sort of hand over the tools to actually restore kelp, if it's even going to be possible in an area, and kind of have a roadmap to get there to make things as easy as possible. And so largely what we do at the Kelp Rescue Initiative is kelp restoration. And so I just wanted to quickly walk you through kind of what that looks like. And so to get started on that, I have to walk you through the kelp life cycle, because it's a little bit complex. And I don't think I mentioned it earlier, but kelp is not actually a plant. It's actually technically a protist. And so it doesn't have a classic plant-like life cycle that you might expect, although it is a little bit similar. So you have what's called the sporophyte, basically the big adult giant kelp. And this works as well for bull kelp, but this is a giant kelp. You have the sporophyte, which is the big one that we're all familiar with, seeing floating in the water. And that will release spores that will settle on the bottom of the ocean, so on the rocks or something like that. And those spores will transform into gametophytes, where one gametophyte will actually fertilize the other gametophyte. And then that will start to grow that fertilized egg on the gametophyte. The tiny little microscopic thing will slowly grow and grow and grow until it turns back into a big, large sporophyte again. And so what we do is we take these little microscopic life stages. Usually we collect them as spores and then let them turn them into gametophytes on their own. And we culture them in the lab. So there's a lab out at Bamfield right now that's doing this. And we've also got another lab at the Deep Bay Marine Field Station. And we grow those little gametophytes until they're ready to be outplanted. When that happens, we take them, we throw them into like a magic bullet blender, and we zap them a couple of times until they fragment into a million little pieces. And then we'll take them and we'll put them in a squirt bottle, and we'll actually just spray them right onto whatever substrate we want to put them on. So that could be something like these little rocks. It could be tiles. And essentially the idea is that then a couple of weeks later, you'll have your little baby kelp starting to grow, and that's going to get bigger and bigger until you're actually able to outplant it onto the bottom. And then as long as the conditions are right, your kelp is going to grow back up into a nice, healthy kelp forest. Now, the big caveat there is if the conditions are right. And so there's a lot of things that can go wrong on the way to trying to restore kelp. And so I'll walk through a little bit of some ongoing projects that we have at the Kelp Rescue Initiative to kind of give you a sense of how a lot of this science kind of comes together and how we're working on coming up with these sort of like best practices. So one of those is directly related to my PhD work at the University of Victoria, which is building better baselines so that we know exactly where we might want to be targeting for kelp restoration. So a lot of this work comes from data that was found in the UVic archives. And basically, there used to be a prof at the university, and his name was Alan Austin. And he was tasked by the DFO to go out and map this red seaweed in the northern strait of Georgia. And is this the seaweed is called, well, now we call it Maziella. Back then it was called Iridia, but it's this sort of like big rubbery bladed red species. And they figured they could use it commercially harvest it to turn it into things like carrageenan or various industrial products. And so Alan Austin went out and he got a plane and they put some cameras on the bottom of the plane and they flew about 90 kilometers of shoreline, quite low down, with taking photos all along the way. And back in 1972, this was very advanced technology for this type of mapping. They had regular photos, so just like a normal RGB, like a really nice camera that you would use to take photos of your, friends and family. And then they also had a camera that could see outside of the wavelengths of human sight, so into what's called the near infrared. And so this near infrared camera, you can see this photo on the bottom here where everything is kind of blue and then there's some glowing red. All of the red in this image is actually vegetation. And so what this special camera can do is it'll pick up the signal that comes down and bounces off and reflects back off of vegetation, whereas everything else kind of stays sort of darker. And so it's a really good way of telling if you're looking at something brown, for example, is that brown actually a seaweed or is that brown just a kind of a rock or, gross sand or something like that. And so they took this data, they put it all together, and they made these really, really cool maps. And the maps showed all of the nearshore vegetation, basically from the south end of Denman Island all the way to the south end of Quadra Island, so up by Campbell River. And they were quite detailed. They have all these vegetation units and showing things like what species or what groups of species were associated with which parts of the shoreline. But importantly, they also showed where all of the bull kelp was back then. And so we wanted to go out and resurvey this and look at how things had changed, knowing that there had been some pretty substantial losses in this area. And so this is where National Geographic and the Trebek Initiative came into play. They helped us fund this project, which is fantastic. And we also partnered up with the Hackeye Institute, who flew their airborne coastal observatory, which is basically a plane with the same sensors that they used all the way back in 1972, except for way more modern. And they flew all the same areas of shoreline along the coast. We also went out and did a bunch of ground truthing with that. This is just some fun photos of my team and I this past summer when we were out collecting data, getting in the water, looking to see what species were around so that we could match that to our aerial imagery. And then also going out and doing a whole bunch of scuba diving to see, okay, so underneath the water, what's happening in these areas where the kelp used to be. And so overall, when we're looking at the data, we're able to see that there are these massive areas that used to be these huge bull kelp forests off of Denman Island and Comox out by Cape Lazo. that are just completely gone. And if you talk to anybody from the area, it's not like it's a new thing. Like everybody knew that there used to be kelp and then it disappeared. But what's really cool about having these maps and this old data is that we're able to show the extent that was actually lost, which is something that up till now hasn't really been able to be done. And so in total, within just this one region, there's about 550 hectares of kelp forest that was lost, which is about 97% of all of the kelp in the whole area, which is absolutely a massive amount. And it's kind of hard. I know I at least have a really hard time sort of thinking spatially about how much area that is. And so I wanted to show you this map showing the comparison that basically the area of kelp forest that was lost just around Comox and Denman Island is larger than all of Stanley Park by a substantial amount. I think it's like 1.5 times or something the size. So you can imagine, how newsworthy it would be if all of a sudden all of the trees in Stanley Park died and disappeared. And this is essentially what has happened off of our coast in the Northern Salish Sea, and just nobody really documented it. And we can look back in time and try and figure out when exactly this had happened. We had some data I mentioned from the paper earlier showing more recent losses, and we knew that there was a couple little spots of kelp that were holding out that seemed to disappear. But these are much, much larger areas than were around even a decade or two ago. And so we can look back at that same lighthouse data, and these bars each represent days of the year for each year along the x-axis here. The amount of days of the year that the sea surface temperature was above 18 degrees Celsius, or for these kind of darker purple, above 20 degrees Celsius. And the records for this Chrome Island here at the southern tip of Denman only go back to the 60s, but you can definitely see this sort of trend where more recently the years have been getting warmer and warmer. And there's another lighthouse a little bit further down, kind of close to Nanaimo, sort of by the DFO station, where you can sort of see the same trend. And basically, as you go back further and further in time, there are less and less years that really go up above that sort of 18-degree threshold. So it's a pretty good smoking gun that, things are getting warmer. They're definitely, I think on average, it's gotten about 2 degrees warmer in this area over the past half century. And so essentially what you're getting is these areas where kelp forests or the underneath the water used to look like this and have now changed. This is just a still photo taken from an ROV survey that we did in the area, where there's just way less productivity, way less growth, and things have definitely changed quite substantially. And so to do restoration, if we actually want to be able to restore some of these areas, or at least attempt to restore some of the kelp in these areas, we need to think of various things. We need to think of what are the ongoing stressors. So it's still warm, which means that chances are if we go out and put kelp out there, it's still going to die off. So, how much of the year will the kelp actually be there? At what point of the year does it actually die so that it can't reproduce for the next year? It has to be at scale and it has to be cost effective. And so we have to look at techniques to try and get as much kelp out there as possible, over a short period of time so that it's not prohibitively expensive to try and do. And then we also have to make sure that it's ecologically relevant for the species that we actually care about. And so we don't want to go out there and actually make things worse than they already are. And B, we don't want to go and spend a whole bunch of money and a whole bunch of effort trying to bring kelp back. And then it turns out that when it's there, it doesn't actually really make a difference because the species that we cared about have already left anyways. And so with that in mind, a lot of the other work that's going on at Kelp Rescue is things like looking at genetics. There are teams that are doing all sorts of things that I'm not even going to pretend to really understand what they are. But there are some really cool talks that have happened recently from the various labs that are working on population genomics and looking at um, how associated with certain populations other populations are, so they can know where they can outplant from and where they can grow kelp, and how far away they can start doing restoration with that kelp. And then we also have a fantastic postdoc in our lab, Dr. Lauren Dykman, and she's doing all sorts of work looking at trials of, what works, what doesn't, how can we really scale up, going from just putting little rocks on the bottom of the ocean to hopefully getting to the hectare level of actually being able to do this restoration without it costing an arm and a leg. And then moving forward, looking towards this year, we're also going to be looking at community use of these restoration habitats. So doing surveys to see if, when we do this restoration, what is actually coming to use these areas. And similar to that paper that I mentioned at the beginning from Schaffer and her team, are the herring in the area? Are the salmon in the area? Are they actually coming in and interacting with and using this habitat preferentially if we put it out there for them? And so ultimately, the idea is to bring together all these different sort of strains of science from all of these fantastic people working on these projects, and come up with a more effective kelp restoration blueprint that we can hopefully then pass on to those people that are wanting to do this type of work all along the coast. And like I mentioned, it's a massive amount of work done by a whole bunch of different fantastic people and labs and groups. We have a ton of contributors to this work. And so a huge thank you to all of them for sure. And yeah, I would be more than happy to take any questions if you've got any.
Wow, Brian, that was fantastic. Thank you so much. For those of you that have been with us, thank you for attending. This is fantastic. We can do this one of two ways. You're welcome to do at the bottom of your screen. There's like a little reaction button, and if you press there, you can raise your hand if you'd like to turn on your camera and have a conversation with Brian. That you're definitely welcome to do that. Or if you're a little bit more shy or just aren't feeling comfortable tonight, if you want to put it in the chat, I'm happy to read them out and then we can hear them that way. So yeah, just take a minute. Feel free to look along the bottom of your screen if you'd like to raise your hand. And in the meantime, I do see a few coming in through the chat. So Ron Reed is asking, so for the resolution of your historic remote sensing photos, are they adequate for comparison with your current imaging? Or if not, can it be enhanced for improved resolution? Or what are you finding about the resolution kind of with the historic and what you've got going on now?
Yeah, great question. So we are extremely lucky in that the people that were going out, Alan Austin and his team, when they planned these, they weren't even thinking about the kelp forests that were there. They were thinking, okay, how can we spot this weird little red seaweed in the intertidal? And so they flew as low down as possible to collect a whole bunch of data. And because of that, we have fantastic resolution of some of these images. I wonder if...
Oh, that's great.
I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to find one in this quick time, but basically you can actually see individual bull kelps at the surface, and the fronds coming off of them and all that stuff. So it's a huge problem with, especially with satellite imagery going back that far. You're looking at often I think in 1972, some of the first satellite imagery came around from Landsat, and those are 60 meter by 60 meter pixels. And we actually went and looked and couldn't find, the signal is just not even good enough to detect even these really big beds from back then. So if we didn't have this one record source, essentially we wouldn't be able to tell that this kelp, where exactly it was and how accurate that was. So yeah, we got very, very lucky with that. And there's some older imagery you can find, like BC aerial archives and things like that, but they fly those just from so much higher up because they were usually looking at forestry stuff. And often they're also black and white, which is really bad for trying to see kelp. Whereas this was in color and near infrared.
Wow, that's awesome. Great, thank you. Yeah, and thanks, past person. Um, all right, I've got Jennifer Sutton says, anecdotally, while kayaking the past 20 years around the south end of Vancouver Island, they've been noticing thicker forests of the kelps at lower tides, especially at East Souk Park and Discovery Island areas. I don't know if that's helpful for you, but just neat to know that people are noticing the kelp around them, and
Yeah,
the fluctuations in them. And then she
yeah.
does ask, if the oceans are warming, what success rate would you expect with replacing kelp in areas where they disappear because of this rising water temperature? Like, yeah.
Yeah, no, good question. So to the first part, definitely one area, and actually a good friend of mine, her name is Alejandra Morisoto, just published a paper, I think in the last like 2 weeks or something like that, that really focuses in on kind of that southern Vancouver Island area, and probably some of the areas at least, like over by Ella Beach, just a bit further from Isuk Park. I know that they look at some kelp beds, and it seems like those ones are definitely very resilient, and it's because of that really high mixing of the water and all the cold water coming in and around from the open ocean that kind of gets upwelled as it comes into the strait. So that's a very positive thing that we have such resilient kelp here, specifically around Victoria and Souk and things like that. Um, and for the second part with the warming, I mean, at this point, I would say things are not looking great. I know that there are some people in our own team, some people in other labs, like the Martone lab, Patrick Martone, who's an amazing phycologist. He teaches seaweed classes and things like that. He's got a great app. If you ever want to look at the seaweed sorter app, I think it's only $5 or
Ooh,
something. And
I think
it'll
I've
go
seen
through
it. It's
it.
awesome.
It's a
Yeah.
really good one. And it'll show you all the different species. But anyways, he's doing some genetics work as well, where they're looking to see if, can you have thermally tolerant strains of kelp that you can outplant to hopefully have them last a little bit longer. But ultimately, especially in some of the hardest hit areas like the North Salish Sea, the problem is it's just too hot no matter what. The kelp is just dying. And
Mm-hmm.
so at that point, it doesn't so much become that you're trying to necessarily put the kelp out there to make it just kind of come back on its own. But this is an annual species, so it normally kind of grows and then dies off in the fall anyways. And so really you're just trying to replace at least part of that life cycle. And even if you have to do it on your own every single year, if it's having a positive effect on the salmon and the herring, maybe that cost benefit is worth it, right? So that's kind of one of the things that we really want to find out is, it's a lot of effort and time and to go through these processes, but if it's worth it in the end, and if we can show that it's worth it, maybe it's something that we can make sure that we're investing money into to make sure that this kelp is around in some of these spots.
Awesome. Thank you. I see someone actually raise their hand. Susan, would you like to ask a question in person?
Hi, everybody. It's Daniel and Susan here. Thank you for a great talk, Brian. Um, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
Loud and clear.
And yeah, also some anecdotal observations, sort of paddling in the Nanaimo area in the mid-90s. There was lots of kelp, relatively speaking, even like right near next to ferry terminals and around Newcastle Island, and then it slowly started fading away. And at the time, I know you mentioned stressors, but at the time there was some persistent rumor that a lot of the die-off originated from a plywood pressure treatment plant in the lower mainland when we're still treating plywood with arsenic. Like now we use copper, right? But back in the day, they really didn't want it to rot, and so it was leaking into the Georgia Basin. And so obviously we don't do this anymore, and hopefully the arsenic's all gone. But was so did it have an influence? Did you funnel that one in, or is it not significant?
Yeah, no, I mean, that's super interesting. Honestly, I had not heard that before. But it would be something that would be very interesting to look into. And I don't know, I mean, I'm not like a geochemist by any means, but I would be curious if there's a way to maybe test like sediments and stuff, because I know that if you take cores, depending on how fast those sediments are accumulating, you can look at certain elements and things like that. So it would be really interesting if it shows up even, or not, or yeah. But that is a super interesting like
just an additional stressor, like
yeah,
that's no longer there, right? But should aid in the
yeah,
recovery. Thanks, Brian.
absolutely. Yeah, thanks.
Thanks so much for, yeah, raising your hand and turning your camera on.
I
It's nice
see
to know we're reaching people.
I
Yeah,
see
the
Tom
chat's
raising his
blowing up.
hand in person.
Oh, I didn't see that. So go ahead. Great. Thank you.
Thanks, Brian. That's a pretty strong, consistent evidence, obviously with a temperature as a factor, but just in terms of one of your original figures, what do you suspect determines the southern distribution of these bull kelp when you look latitudinally? Is it temperature, or is it a browser, or is it fish, or do you have an idea what defines the southern edge of the distribution?
Do you mean like as it goes further south into like California and places like that? That is a good question. I would be totally guessing, because I'm not that familiar with what's going on with kelp forests down all the way in those parts of California. But my understanding is that where the bull kelp is persistent, it's largely areas that are very, very wave swept. And so it's too wave swept for the macrocystis in many cases to grow. Whereas as you kind of get further and into the Channel Islands, it's also wave swept, but the kelp is quite a lot deeper growing. And so then you get in areas where the two can co-inhabit, you'll often have the macrocystis over time takes over. And so then you'll have the whole bed will become a giant kelp bed. But in the areas that are high enough disturbance that the bull kelp can persist, but the giant kelp cannot because it has so much more drag on it, that's where those bull kelp beds seem to persist. And it's pretty similar. Like, I mean, in and around our area, Victoria, it's a salinity thing for sure. But like on a lot of the coast, on the central coast, where there's a lot of the overlapping kelp, it's kind of that similar sort of thing going on, where in the more high current channels and the more wave swept areas is where you'll see the bull kelp. And then in the bays and areas that the giant kelp can actually persist year after year, that's where it kind of takes over and kicks out the bull kelp. So that would be my guess. But it would be good to ask a.
So as you move further south of that, I mean, in terms of the tropical areas, I guess you don't really get the large kelp forests. So you lose basically all of them. So what is it that defines basically that endpoint where your kelp forests, right, basically are lost from the system? I'm just trying to think. I mean, temperature is obviously such an obvious one here, but you know, are there other possible components to this absence of kelp here that, I don't know, there may be some insight if one could identify what the limits to the southern distribution are latitudinally. I don't know. I mean, I'm just guessing here, but I don't know.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point. And I think that really speaks to how much more collaborative, like international science we need to do on this kind of stuff. We often get into our own little silos. And I know that even just, you know, we have this group of kelp researchers that meets between BC and Washington, and it's every, you know, whatever, few months. And every single time I feel like everyone's saying, oh, we need to do more science, you know, between BC and Washington. And it just always seems to never really actually end up happening, because I think there's a lot of funding problems and things like that. But I totally agree that it would be great to get some insights from those southern distributions. And I know that there are even some great researchers down in Mexico looking at a few other kelp species that kind of taper off as you go further down at the, not just the canopy former limits, but the total kelp limits. So it'd be interesting to look at both of those, I think, and see what's happening.
Yeah, it could be there. I mean, even genomics might give us some insight, because obviously there's got to be temperature, warmer temperature adaptations, you know, as you go further south that would obviously show up probably in genomics or something, but yeah.
Yeah, I wouldn't be
Yeah.
surprised.
Yeah. Yeah. Anyway, thank you. Very interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah.
Awesome. That's a great conversation. Like, yeah, definitely tropics is, you know, probably temperature and the things you've touched on here. I'm also wondering like nutrients, obviously, probably in those warm tropical oligotrophic waters. And that actually leads into some of the other questions. Some people were wondering here, kind of getting into that nutrients and chemical composition, but also what about, Adolf was wondering, what about the CO2 concentration? How is that combining with water? Is that an issue you think for kelp forests, or
Right.
is
So
kelp starving for CO2, he said?
my understanding, especially from that specific area where I was talking about towards the end around like Denman Island and Bain Sound, is that the water there is actually very acidic. And so again, I'm gonna fail my like grade 10 or whatever it is, biogeochemistry lesson, but essentially there is an abundance of CO2 derivatives that are in the water in that area. And so that usually actually helps kelp grow. And so those are the types of areas that you might actually expect to be pretty good. And I think kelp will also kind of buffer it and kind of like re-lower the CO2. There's some studies from California where they looked at that, where the water passing into a kelp forest and the water coming out the other side, it actually brought down the levels of acidity just from buffering it out of that system. And so I don't think that that's necessarily the issue here, although again, that is a little bit outside of my, I feel like hopefully one of my collaborators would have told me like, hey, dummy, look at the CO2. But they didn't. So hopefully that is not just something I'm completely overlooking.
Awesome. Just being mindful of the time, I'm going to keep going on questions, but one of them was if you could bring up your email again in case someone has to go. So while I read you out the next question, if you wouldn't mind putting your email back up.
Totally.
And you're getting lots of thank yous, great talks and all that good stuff. But one of the next questions, what do you think human pollution, including sewage, has a role in kelp loss?
Yeah, good question. I know that is something that various places along the coast have experienced kelp loss due to sewage runoff. And I think from what I've seen, at least, mostly that's been in areas that are further down a little bit, further down the coast where there's not as much flow of water. So like Victoria, for example, we were dumping waste into our water for a long time. And the idea was that there was enough water movement around here that, it probably had some negative effects, but at least it wasn't affecting the kelp, it didn't seem. But then you get into the areas where the water is more stagnant, and that can definitely be a big problem. And so as our, northern coastal communities grow, I think that's going to be a really important thing to make sure that we're treating water properly before it's getting dumped out into the ocean, because I know that even just recently, last year, I was up in Dajinggeets on Haida Gwaii, and just anecdotally, people talking about how, oh, we don't even harvest around here anymore because everything's polluted because of all the sewage runoff. And so I think that, yeah, especially as our populations grow, it's going to be really important to make sure that we're treating that and at least getting it back into the ocean in a much safer state.
Awesome. Are you feeling okay to keep going with questions?
Yeah, love it.
Awesome. Okay, great. Next up, has the loss of kelp affected the heron spawning on the coast?
Good question. So spawning, probably not specifically, and at least not with bull kelp, because the bull kelp actually doesn't start growing. So the herring are hopefully going to spawn like, I don't know, next week, in 2 weeks, maybe something like that. And the bull kelp itself isn't actually going to be popping up until, probably April, May or something like that. So by then the herring eggs should have all hatched and they'd be swimming around. But in other places, where especially where giant kelp is around, and that's the perennial kelp that is there year after year. That's a big concern of different coastal First Nations is because there's the whole roe herring spawn on kelp that they harvest. And so in areas where either bryozoans, little tiny, that's something I didn't really talk about today, but Mycera Costa is working on a project with Dr. Ann Solomon, two profs who are looking at bryozoans and how they encrust on kelps and how that damages the tissues and can sink them to the bottom and kill them and things like that. And so there are definitely various concerns with kelp loss and the herring roe. As far as the actual abundance of the herring, I'm not totally sure if there's a direct causal link between that. I could imagine that if there's just nothing on the bottom, like the understory and stuff, that wouldn't be good for the herring. But I don't think I've seen any causal relationship there between those two things. Not to say it isn't happening, but yeah, I'm not sure if it's in the literature at all.
Okay, thank you. I think you sort of already answered this, but just wanted to double check. Kelsey says, thank you so much for wonderful and informative talk. I'm just wondering if your restoration efforts are solely based on the bull kelp, or if you're also working with the giant kelp and any other secondary species for your
yeah, good question.
efforts?
And I apologize if I wasn't probably very clear on this because I was jumping back and forth between different places and different things, but definitely we're focusing right now on bull kelp and giant kelp. And so in the Salish Sea, the area that I kind of focused in on at the end, that's just bull kelp because bull kelp is the only one that grows there because of the salinity, or that used to grow there, I guess. But then on the other side, we're also doing a lot of work out in Barkley Sound, for example, and that's where a lot of our giant kelp restoration trials are happening out on that side. So yeah, so far just those two, but there's also ideas around trying to outplant multiple species, some of the understory species with them. So yeah, there's a lot of thoughts around that. We haven't quite got there yet because it's all pretty new still, but working towards it for sure.
Great, thank you. I'm going to keep going.
Yeah.
Is anyone looking into genetically modifying kelp so that it can survive in warmer water?
Yeah, good question. So yes, maybe not in the way of using like CRISPR or like some of those really new fancy genetic tools quite yet, but more so from a natural selection, or I guess unnatural selection point of view, where different generations of kelp, for example, are being chosen and like at different life stages, they're being treated with different temperatures of water. And then if they survive that, then they take those ones and grow a bunch more of them and then try heat shocking them again and then see if they survive. And then the idea is that you kind of can maybe build up or select for the most thermotolerant of all of the kelps in those strains. So we're not specifically doing that, but that's, I believe, pretty close to what Patrick Martone is doing. And there's a few other labs along the coast that are doing that type of thing. Most of our genetic research has been more so just from taking natural populations. So we, for example, some of the closest populations in the North Salish Sea, for example, to Hornby and Denman Island that are existing are in this place called Oyster River. And so we took some kelp from there, and then a little bit further up by Campbell River, and then further down closer to Vancouver and further down closer to Victoria, and then just do experiments growing those in warmer water and see how they all do. And so that's kind of a little bit more what we've been focused on, but there's different variations of that basically to see what's happening and how the kelp reacts.
Fun experimenting, but not necessarily modifying.
Yeah.
For the last part. Yeah. Awesome. Cool.
Yeah.
I didn't summarize that well.
I was just going to say, mostly I just wanted to say it's not like we're on the industrial, like GMO style, like, going in and manipulating different genes and stuff specifically. It's not quite at that stage yet, is what I was going to say. But I think you did a
Awesome.
great job summarizing.
Yeah. Do you suspect the commercial herring fisheries have had an impact on kelp sites, especially it's saying on the kelp forest nest near Denman?
Good question. You know, I honestly don't know enough about how those fisheries are undertaken and like where how deep in the water they are, or if they drag. Like I would imagine that they're trying to generally avoid the bottom because there's a lot of large glacial radicals in the area. So just gigantic, like, you know, size of your car rocks that are just kind of hanging out on the bottom. And so if you're trying to drag any nets down there, I would imagine that that would be really bad news for the boats. So I'm guessing that they don't go directly on the bottom there, which would definitely, if they were dragging, would rip up a lot of stuff.
Mm.
But yeah, I don't, that's a good question. I don't know too much about it. I do know, I can say that, and I didn't actually talk about this at all really in my talk today, but another thing that we really focused on, because some of the amazing parts about this data that we were looking at this past summer, not only did they have kind of some general maps and some aerial photos, but they had really, really detailed quadrat and transect data going all the way into the subtidal. And so we redid all of those
Great.
surveys as well to look at like 100 species or so of different seaweeds, not just kelps, but little reds and greens and all sorts, to look at community shifts and how that's changing. And there's we're not done analyzing those data yet, but there's some huge shifts in the community that seem to be more indicative of just, again, things are getting way warmer. So like more heat tolerant species are doing better, and a lot of the understory kelps, for example, are doing a lot worse, and have reduced in abundance. So yeah, not to say that the herring spawn, I personally don't agree with the herring spawn, and that I would be happy if they weren't doing it, but I'm not sure if that would be the driver necessarily compared to something like the intense heat increase that's happened over the past half century or so.
That's interesting. I was going to ask if no one asked questions about community shifts you're seeing, so that's great to hear that's underway.
Once we've got that data together, maybe I'll come back next year and do another more detailed one on that.
Ooh, don't tempt me. I'll have you back. And I think everyone else will too. Someone's wondering about, are there any citizen science projects or ways that like concerned citizens, like the people listening tonight, can help with any of these efforts? Is it mostly just financial, or is there any like activities they can do?
Yeah, good question. You know, and I get asked that a fair bit. And annoyingly, I never really have that good of an answer because at this point in time, I mean, even just a lot of what's happening in the kelp like restoration world specifically is just very technical and takes a lot of I don't know, like training and things like that. So we even had like a restoration club, for example, at UVic, a whole bunch of real keen undergraduates who go out and do different restoration projects for like salt marshes and stuff. And they wanted to get involved. And it was like, yeah, like it's just kind of dangerous and we can't really train you on it. I would say that something that is helpful is just from the keeping record side of things, using apps like, for example, iNaturalist and things like that, where if you see a nice kelp forest and you've got a good vantage point, you know, snap a photo and throw it up on iNaturalist. And those types of records can really come in handy because you never know, you know, where the kelp is going to disappear from next, right? And so if we had had iNaturalist, you know, at a lot of our sites along Nanoose and things like that back in the day, we'd probably have great records of how big some of these kelp beds used to be. And it, you know, a lot of that is lost because there's just no real pictures that we know of, or maybe they're in somebody's old fishing album or something like that, but they never get shared or put online or whatever, right? So that would be my probably best advice. And then, I mean, obviously financially supporting, especially smaller projects and things like that for local community groups. I know that like Project Watershed, for example, is a group up in the Comox area that's been really active with sort of pushing for kelp restoration and habitat restoration in general. So that can definitely be very handy for a lot of those kind of smaller organizations.
Oh, fantastic. And yeah, you mentioned iNaturalist, which is, you know, one of these you take a picture, you upload it, and the global community tries to identify them. But that brings up actually a bunch of people were asking about the seaweed sorter. Do you want to say what it was again?
Yeah.
I used it once. It was really great, actually. I liked it a lot.
Yeah, it's fantastic. So let me, I'll see if I can actually pull it up on my phone as I talk about it. But so basically, it's this app that is sort of like a dichotomous key to walk you through how to identify what seaweed you're looking at. And so you pull it up. Oh, hold on. You pull it up, it looks something like this, and you'll say start. And it'll walk you through a bunch of questions like, is it almond brown, olive yellow, blah, blah, blah. You can say yes. And then the next question will be something else. Is it, the size of your hand or the size of your little finger? Does it have root-like projections on the bottom? And so they're meant to be questions that anybody can answer, because a lot of the time in dichotomous keys, they just throw jargon at you. And even, someone like me who studies seaweeds for the last bunch of years, I go through a dichotomous key and I'm like, I don't know what half of these words mean, or how to tell them apart or whatever. So basically, it's just a really nice, friendly way. And then eventually it'll work through and it'll say, oh, is this what you're looking at? And it'll give you a suggestion. So it's really nice. It's got good pictures. It's pretty cheap. And there's also, you can just go to the species list and work through that and just go look and click on species, and it'll pop up and tell you a little bit about it and where you'll find it and all that kind of stuff. So if you're interested in rooting around in the intertidal, it's a great resource.
Awesome. Thank you. Mary Morris says, you showed a recent seabed photo near Comox, and you showed a lot of like understory kelp. How does the understory kelp fit into the seabed ecology? Could you comment on that? I'm sorry, I'm not sure if I read that fully properly, but does that make sense to you?
No, totally. So
yeah.
So this is the photo that I was talking about, or that I think Mary is talking about. So this is just a still that I took from a ROV survey that we were doing. And so the understory kelp is everything in this photo, for example, that's kind of this like browner color for the most part. There might be some other brown species down there that aren't technically kelps, but we'll ignore that for now. And so basically, they're still an important part of the ecology, and it's really good that they're still there. But generally, they're just not as productive as the ones that come all the way up to the surface. And so what I mean by that is just that they don't grow as fast. They don't put as much like detritus and nutrients out into the surrounding waters. They're not as complex, so they don't make quite as good of, or at least they don't make exactly the same type of habitat that a bunch of other species might use. And so it's not to say, I mean, definitely those understory species are very important, and they all kind of have their own roles, especially depending on which depths you're at. Or sometimes if you're up in the intertidal, there's kelp up in the intertidal in some places. And so they are definitely still quite important. But I think the real reason that the big showy ones always get the attention is A, because they're so cool and they're right at the surface where everybody can see them when they go missing, but also B, because they grow so much and so fast that they just produce a lot more for the local ecosystems. Hopefully
that's great.
that
I think you did get it. I think I just missed a word when I was reading out loud, so that's why the sentence sounded strange. I just missed one word. So awesome. Thank you. Mary, if that's not right, feel free to write it again or raise your hand again. We are getting closer to the end of the questions. Next up was, is the BC government aware of your work, and are they taking any precautionary efforts at conservation?
Yes. So we actually work often fairly closely. So any restoration that we do, we have to have permits from the BC government. So they are very aware of every single little bit of work that we're doing. But the great thing is that the people, especially currently, that are working, specifically for the areas of the BC government that we interact with, are often like ex-kelp people, and like they're, biologists, and they're people in our sort of kelp nerd community. So they want to see these types of projects succeed as well. Yeah, so that's been fantastic. We're working often very closely, or like getting grants or things like that from the BC government. From a conservation perspective, I would say that it's a little bit trickier, because in a lot of cases, I mean, the difference between conservation and restoration, if you think about it, right, is that if you're trying to do conservation of kelp, you can, theoretically put a line on a map and say, hey, this is where we're protecting kelp. Nobody go in and ruin the kelp here. But often it's much, much larger problems that we can't really control the borders of, right? And so if there's a big marine heat wave, the line on the map that the BC government said we're saving the kelp here isn't going to make any difference. Or if a bunch of urchins move in, it's not going to make a difference. And so I think that it's almost a dangerous line to walk, because I know that there's a big push lately in different groups that we talk with, where to kind of put these designated spaces on a map and say like, hey, look at us, we're conserving kelp in these areas because it's kind of a hot item right now. But the trick is it needs to be done in a way that is actually making a difference, and not just being like a nice political line on a map to have everybody pat themselves on the back about it until the kelp disappears anyways.
Ready for the next one?
Let's do it.
Okay. Following the Exxon Valdez oil spill in 1989, Doug Reimer and Ed Owens were hired to take high resolution and large scale video imagery of the BC coast for oil spill contingency planning. This imagery might be useful to complement the 1972 imagery by Alan Austin, and should allow you to greatly expand the spatial coverage. So this was by Mike Miles. I don't know if you know that data set, if you've looked at it, is it high enough resolution or know how to access it?
Yeah, so good question, or good point, I should say. I know that, so what we were using, very similar to that, because I know that that's like why Environment Climate Change Canada was doing modern imagery. Some of the older imagery is from a group called Shore Zone, and I don't know for sure if that's the same group, but I do know that they started doing things in the United States. So they did a bunch of the same things that we did, but along the Alaska shoreline, as well as parts of like Washington and down into Oregon, I think. I am not 100% aware if that is the exact same data set, but I would imagine that if not, that's what kind of led to the ones that we were using here in BC. But that is a good question. And I would say that probably after this paper that I was just talking about today gets published, which is hopefully in the next like couple of weeks, once they finish crossing their T's and dotting their I's, that will lead to some of our colleagues from north of the border or south of the border doing similar work with those types of data sets. Not to say that we also couldn't go and do that, but I think it's often just like a matter of time and effort and going through the whole funding cycle. And it's really hard to get funding, for example, in BC to then go and say, hey, we're doing this up in Alaska. So it would be great to collaborate on for sure. I mean, I definitely will look into it. And actually, if you don't mind, maybe like emailing me the names of those people so I can look into it a bit further and make sure that we aren't missing specifically that data, because sometimes just a couple of years further back can actually really make a difference. So I appreciate it. And definitely I'll look a bit further into that.
And one of our colleagues, Mary Morris, did indicate that a lot of that data has fed into the BC Shore Zone project, like you were saying.
Right.
So I think you're covered there, but I will make sure to just get this information to you just in case.
Sure, thank you.
Yeah. And how far can spores travel? I wonder if any of these would make their way north as well. Was the second part of that?
So it depends how you define travel, I guess. So if they are falling, so first of all, it depends what species we're looking at. So if we're looking at bull kelp, the spores come out of the blades on the top and drop to the bottom, kind of like little leaves. The blades break off and they just go psh, 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 psh. They don't travel super far from just falling from the surface to the bottom. Even if there's a current, they might go a little ways here or there, but they're not going too far. It's mostly when the whole thing breaks free. And then since the like hold fast is not actually a root system, it's just something to hold it in place. Often the kelp can survive for like weeks and weeks, maybe even months, if the conditions are right, as it floats around. And in that case, it can very easily be dropping spores that whole time as it's going. And so definitely, and it's sort of the same thing with giant kelp, except for that the spores come from the bottom near the holdfast. So in those cases, it barely goes anywhere when it's held tight. But again, if it rips loose and it floats around for like a week or two, it could be dropping spores as it goes. So there's kind of like these rafting scenarios where that can happen, and you can go way offshore, for example, out into the ocean. You can find a big chunk of kelp floating around. So people think that that's largely how they're able to kind of like interconnect with populations and sort of bolster their genetics over longer periods of time. So yes, they could go north as a short answer to a long answer.
They're great. I think that's what we're all here for, the long answers. We like it. But speaking of which, it's almost 9. So there's one question left, but just in case anyone had a really hard leave time, I just wanted to thank everyone for attending today. You've been a super engaging audience. Really appreciative of that. And thank you, Brian. That was a really cool talk. And yeah, a great subject for us all to discuss. So thank you again for your time. Next month, start paying attention to, if you'd like to join to some of these talks in person, please feel free to look at trying to get to the Berwick House, Royal Oak Berwick House in particular, the one off of Elk Drive. So yeah, thank you again, everyone. And the final question is, do you think an increase in small scale kelp farming could help increase its abundance in general? Which is, do you want me to read that one more time, or did that?
Do I think that an increase in small scale kelp farming could help increase its abundance in general? I mean, I guess it depends on how you're looking at it, but technically, well, okay, let me actually throw that out the window and say, there's a kid, a guy, a young man that sits right across from me in my lab, and he is actually studying kelp farms and habitat with Cascadia seaweed. And so he's specifically kind of looking into that and seeing if it works as habitat. So if by increase in abundance, you mean increase in habitat, like within the kelp farm, it seems like it, from what I've heard from him at least, it kind of seems like it depends on which species you're looking at and what's using it and when they're using it and all that. If you mean an increase in getting those kelps to then go out into their ecosystem and like help bolster the natural population around them, I would say that I doubt it. And mostly that's because the kelps that are on those kelp farms get harvested before they would be reproducing. And so it's like they're pretty early in the spring. Like I think it's usually like May or something like that. They pull up all the lines, they cut off all the kelp, because if it stays out any longer, it's just not as fresh and nice. And it doesn't sell as well. You can't turn it into products as well. And so, yeah, there may be some short-term benefits. And I mean, definitely, I think kelp farming, as far as all the types of farming you could possibly do, is probably the most benign of all of them. But I also don't know necessarily if the benefits from like an ecological perspective are quite there. Although I will defer that, to keep an eye out. Probably in the next year or so, there will be a paper coming out about that. Maybe it'll make the local news.
Awesome. I think that we are going to stop it there. I don't know if you have a moment to peruse the chat, but a lot of people are saying thank you so much for your time and all those great things.
Thanks for
thank you for
having
your
me. This was
thoughtful
super fun.
answers. Oh, good,
And
good.
I would
You're
agree.
welcome back anytime.
Really good. I mean, I don't think I've ever actually had this many questions from a talk. So super fun to get to answer all sorts, or try at least to answer all sorts of things. It was really engaging, and I appreciate getting invited.
Oh, great. Yes. Okay. Well, good night, everybody. Safe travels, or I mean, the commute for a lot of us is very close, so that's great. And yes, and happy leap year February. So thank you again, Brian. This recording is going to be available on YouTube. I'll make sure to share you a link for you so you can share to your contacts. But for those of you who want to check out the Victoria Natural History Society website, and then it links to our YouTube page. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks a lot.
Okay, bye.